I think one of the things that, when any of these offences, we think of any kind of offence, they cover a whole range of different...
Sure. But when you look at this, because they are at the discretion of the individual officers, but then you have to say, even if we accept that these are possibly minors doing things that they shouldn't be doing, the rise of the internet, the access to photos and so on, why has this gone up by 40% since 2019?
Well, of course, one of the things that happened between 2019 and now was COVID. And, a lot of the courts were closed during COVID. So I suspect, I don't know this, but I suspect that part of the reason behind this rise is that actually the courts weren't open and the police were dealing often with quite difficult situations. They're trying to think, well, how can we just get a resolution? Because if we try and get them through the court, it's going to be 3 years before anything's done. So I suspect that's part of it. I suspect another reason is that the justice system overall is facing massive pressures. We've got a huge backlog of cases waiting to go through the courts, partly again because of COVID. We've got prisons bursting at the seams. And so probably what's happening is that police officers are having to try and take some, what they would consider to be sensible judgment calls about what they would see as being fairly minor offences, saying, look, can we just get this off the books? Can we get this agreed? It shouldn't have happened. The person who's done it has apologised. The victim has accepted the apology. Great, let's just draw a line under it and move on. And that way, of course, you're actually resolving it probably a lot more quickly.
But also, if you then look at this using community resolutions for things like robbery, which has gone up 127%, and it also links very nicely into an article in the Daily Mail today, which is essentially, as we know, police have pretty much decriminalised shoplifting. You can nick £199 worth of stuff from your local Tesco and no one will go after you.
Well, there's an issue about enforcement, and I absolutely agree with you on that. There is the police are, in some ways, we have probably more police actually than we've had in many years. But on the other hand, they are still also quite finely spread at times, particularly in these kinds of crucial moments. So there's certainly an issue about enforcement of shoplifting. Do we actually catch the person who's done the shoplifting? There is then also the penalty and the punishment if they're caught. And even if you're stealing small items, that you can get a fine from doing that. So I don't think it's decriminalised, but I do take seriously, certainly for many shopkeepers, it must be incredibly annoying, distressing, makes them feel very angry that they feel that people just walk into their shop, nick stuff and walk away with no punishment.
But surely, again, we're not seeing a police presence on the street. So I have one of those small local Tesco's right next to my flat. On a weekly basis, people are nicking stuff. I mean, daily basis, people are nicking stuff. They smashed the window the other day and nicked a crate of beer. They've got security guards in there with body cams, and that's not something, it's not an atmosphere I want to shop in. But of course, if we're not prosecuting those people, they're more likely to do it again. We know that actually it's recidivism. It's people who've already nicked stuff come back and nick more stuff.
Oh, yeah, and I mean, it's awful. I think, to live in a neighbourhood where that's your experience is terrible. I don't think anybody who think that's a good idea, apart from obviously those who are doing the shoplifting. I think the police have a difficult job. They can't be, in all places all times, and particularly some of these shoplifting events, they happen very quickly. They're in, they're out, and they're off. And then, by the time you've called the police, they're, 3 blocks down the road. So there is an issue there. I think, shopkeepers can take some sensible precautions to try to reduce the risk of stuff being stolen. But yeah, it's really, really annoying, and it's really, really upsetting when it happens.
And when you look at these numbers, just 431 shoplifters in the year to March received fixed penalty notices. This is down 98% from a decade ago. So I think it is multifactorial. Not enough police on the streets, but also, as you say, no capacity. You can't get them through the courts because the courts were backed up in COVID. But also, at the same time, we don't have any prison places. And yet, for those people who mentioned something on Twitter, you're thrown in prison for 3 years. So so priorities seem to be completely misguided.
Yeah, I have some sympathy with what you're saying, and I think it's very difficult when you're kind of seeing stuff going on in your neighbourhood that you kind of feel the police really should be doing something about. And then, as you say, you see accounts of people being sent to prison often for quite long periods of time for, on the face of it, seem to be fairly petty offences. It must be very aggravating, Now, we've had over a decade of austerity in the justice system, right back from about 2010, massive reductions in budgets for the police, for the probation service, prison system for the courts, a lot of courts closed, and I think it would be a really good idea for this incoming government to just do a major review of the state of the justice system and come up with a long-term plan to ensure that we have what's needed, which is a police force that's responsive. There's not everywhere. They don't need to be in everyone's business all the time, but they do need to be responsive, and they do need to be seen to be responsive. A court system that acts efficiently, prison places that are available where they're needed, but as long as they're not locking up people unnecessarily, and probation service that's actually functional. After many years of disastrous reforms, probation service itself is in a pretty poor state. So there's lots of problems across the justice system, and some of what you're talking about are kind of, as it were, kind of expressions, they're symptoms of that wider malaise.
I understand that. And of course, on the back of the Notting Hill Carnival, which we talked about over the weekend, we now know that the woman remains in a life-threatening condition. Now, she was caught in the middle of this. We talked about zombie knives being banned, the amnesty that's coming at the same time. But the idea, what is going on in this country where you think it's OK to rock up to a carnival with a zombie knife and stab someone?
Well, I don't know. And I don't know really, when it's ever okay to carry a zombie knife, whether it's at a carnival or anywhere else. What we know is that when young people who carry knives are asked, why are you carrying a knife? A lot of them will say, well, it's for my own protection. Now, even if that's actually, they're misguided in that, or they're lying, or whatever, I think the reality is that there's lots of, particularly young men, who do actually feel unsafe on the streets from other young men, and of course also young women. So there is a kind of an objective thing going on there. But yeah, of course people shouldn't be taking these big knives to carnivals. There is something about, I think, these big occasions, where quite often, things happen. People do get attacked, people get stabbed, people get hit. And in some ways, if you're just going to have so many people together in a very concentrated place, then things will happen. But yeah, this is an awful situation, and, I think it's good that the perpetrators appear to have been caught fairly promptly, but clearly that's not going to be any, consolation to this woman who's been attacked, and for her family, who are obviously going to be incredibly worried now.
Absolutely right. And of course, Keir Starmer was talking about prisons earlier in the Rose Garden. He said, I can't build a prison by Monday. And actually, someone's just messaged saying, I didn't expect Starmer to build new prisons by Monday, but surely he can tell us where he's going to build new prisons, because that is what a government in waiting that promised to hit the ground running should have planned for months ago. Where do you stand on this? Our current capacity, I think, is 87,000 in terms of our prison population. Now, that seems incredibly low when you have a population of, 67 million or thereabouts. By 2027, our capacity will be 106,000 with bringing on new places. But we don't have enough places. Keir Starmer said today, on a daily basis, he looks at the numbers of prison places available, and then you're deciding justice based on the number of prison places. That's completely the wrong way round.
Yeah, well, he's got an inheritance which is not of his making, of course, so I think it's, they're only a few months into a new government, and they obviously can't be blamed for the situation they've inherited from the previous government. And it goes back partly to these questions of austerity and the lack of investment in prisons. We've got prisons which are about 8,000 to 10,000 overcrowded as it stands, and we do need to try and bring down the numbers currently in prison wherever we can, and there are certainly things that could be done in that regard. And as you mentioned, some people maybe who are being sent to prison unnecessarily now. But it's going to take a long time. I think it's really unlikely that the government's going to hit their targets of anything close to 106,000 prison places in the time that they have allotted, because just all the experience of previous years says that governments always undershoot their expectations and their targets for building new prisons, because they always take longer than you expect. There are all sorts of reasons why you lose prison places as well, because you're not maintaining the existing state, because you're cutting costs there. So there is a real issue there, and I suspect we're just going to see a number of combination of certainly some attempts to get more capacity on stream, but just some more quick fixes to try to, kind of limit the increasing numbers going into the system as it stands.
Finally, can I just ask you about Shabana Mahmood and the idea that you only have to serve, 40% of your time now before you're released? This is to free up about 5,000 places. It may apply to as many as 20,000 places. What are your thoughts, given your expertise in this area? Is that the right move?
Well, I think it's probably one of the few things that she could have done. She was dealt a pretty tough hand, frankly, and given the options on the table. I think the other thing that she could have done is look at expediting the release of the so-called IPP prisoners. These are people who've been in prison maybe initially on a 2-year sentence, 10 years on, they're still in prison. They just got lost in the bureaucracy. So I think there are other things that she could have done as well. But it's worth bearing in mind that if someone serves 40% of their sentence now, that's still longer than if they'd been serving 50% of their sentence, say, 5 years ago. So we've seen an escalation and an increase in sentence length over a number of years now, and that's part of the problem here, that, you know, the only way seems to be up. And so we have this ridiculous situation where Parliament legislates for ever longer sentences, and then the Justice Secretary, through administrative means, effectively quietly reduces sentence length through measures like this. It's a bit messed up politically, frankly. I think we just need a more honest political culture.
Well, I think that's absolutely the key here, which is communication. Had Shabana Mahmood said that, actually, sentences are getting longer, so therefore the reduction to 40% is still means that they're serving more time. I think then, actually, the public may have been more on side than I think they currently are. Really good to talk to you. Thank you very much indeed, Richard. Richard Garside there, Director of the Centre for Crime and Justice Studies.